Hello everyone, this is Aryan from More Than Just a Game, and today we will take a look at implementation of flying in Unreal Engine. Um, if you're not familiar with the process I'm taking here and this is all new to you, please refer to our first video on superpowers, which was super speed implementation. I've basically skipped some of the groundwork that I did in that video to keep the video as short as possible. But I'm just gonna go over what I've done so far in this flying superpower component real quick just to make sure. Okay, we have our input mapping context. We have two input actions. One is for toggling flight because we want the player to be able to both fly and walk. And then we have an input action for elevating the player because in the default Unreal Engine flying movement type, it doesn't actually go up and down. It just flies in a static Z basically. So we need some input action to elevate the player, make the player go up and down. And then we keep a reference to the character that is attached. This component is attached to. We have a function called setUpPlayerInput, which basically just binds actions to our functions. Then inside our implementation, we have the implementation of setUpPlayerInput. Just take a look at our previous video. Right over here we have event trigger toggle started for toggle flight because we want the flight to be basically toggled when the button is pressed, and this is in red because I haven't defined this function yet. And then we have elevate player action, which has event trigger type of triggered because we want this to be a continuous action. So if the player keeps holding that button, it would keep elevating the player. So yeah, that's it. So let's get down to adding our basically variables and functions. So first we want to have a reference to our flight animation because we don't want our player to be walking in the air. Obviously it's gonna have an animation, so we do uAnimation asset, we call it flight animation. It's gonna be null at the start. Then we want to keep a reference to the default animation class of the player. So this is going to be default animation class. This is also going to be null. And let's make this editable too. Then we just basically have a float, which is our flying speed. I'm just going to give it 6,000, and that's it for our public basically variables. Then we have some private variables. We have the owner actor already. We want to have a replicated variable. It's called, so because it's replicated and we want this to be replicated using, I'm gonna shortly explain what this means. We write it down like this. So first of all, we want the flight to be disabled at the start, and we want to start it when the player commands it to be started. And then this means that this variable has to be set by the server only. The client cannot change this because this is replicated. And we have this, we have replicated. This means that if the server sets this to true, it becomes true for all the clients. But when we set it to replicate it using and we provide a function name like this, it means that not only if the server set this to true, it would be set to true for all the clients, but when the value of this changes, in addition to be setting to the new value for the clients, this function is also called. So naturally, we also want to have a function which is called basically this. So whenever the value of this changes, this function is called for all the clients. And then we have another replicated value. We don't want this to call any function, so we just write replicated, and this is vertical movement. By default it's gonna be 0, and it can go from -1 to 1. When you're using keyboard, it's basically in just 3 states. It's either -1 or 0 or 1. But if you're using a gamepad or controller, this could have a continuous value. Basically it could be -0.5. So yeah, that's why we chose float, not integer. Okay, then we have another function. It's called, okay, we actually want this function to be called from the server, called on the server. Actually, we are gonna call this server flight enabled, because changes like this have to be made by the server. This one is a local function. It's called toggle flight. Then we have 2 more server functions. One is server request enable flight. The other is server request disable flight. Okay, and I think that's almost it. We have one more function. It's called elevate player. This is gonna receive input action value, because we want to know what the value of that input action is for elevating the player. Is it -1 or is it +1? And yeah, that's it. Okay, we actually need one more server function. So yeah, server reliable, and then server enable flight, and this is gonna receive our elevation value, so the server knows by what value it should elevate the player. And then we have one more function. We need to actually override this function. I'm gonna write virtual void get lifetime replicated props, and then I'm gonna just generate the definitions, the empty definitions for these functions. So I'm just gonna pause the video and come back. Okay, so let's get started with the actual implementation of the feature. So in our begin play, as usual, we're gonna just get access to our character. This is also explained in the previous video. Then we are gonna call this function set is replicated because we want to replicate this component. Then we are gonna set the flying speed of the character, so we get access to character movement, and then max fly speed, we set it to our flying speed. And then yeah, that's it. So okay, yeah, one more thing we need to do is binding to this delegate. It's called input setup delegate. This is also explained in the previous video why we do this and why we don't directly call the function. And yeah, as you can see, this is not red anymore because the functions are available. So we are just gonna go ahead and actually fill the definitions for these functions. So first we have toggle flight. Naturally, because this is toggling, we want to check if flight is already enabled or not. We are not just gonna write this, because this is called on the client and this is a replicated variable, so we don't want to set this from the client. We actually can't set this from the client. Only the server has access to setting this the value for this property. So anyways, if flight is enabled and the player has requested to toggle it, we naturally want to disable it. So we call server request disable flight, and if it's not enabled, we want to enable it. So we call request enable flight. So now let's go to the definitions for these. It's right here. We have request disable flight. So what we are gonna do is now this function is running on the server, so we can actually set this value. We say flight enabled is set to false, and as two safety measures we are gonna call the onRep function directly, and then we are gonna say force net update just to make sure that this is updated through the network. We do basically the exact same in the request enable flight, but we set it to true this time. So now what's next? We want to basically populate this onRep function. It's right over here. So let's go and see what we should do about it. So just to avoid getting the components many times throughout this function, we are gonna keep a reference to the skeletal mesh component of the actor, the character actually. We are gonna say owner actor get mesh. This returns the main root mesh of the character. We also want access to the character movement component of the actor, so we call it owner movement, and we say basically just get character movement. Then if flight is enabled, it means that it just got enabled, it just toggled and now it is enabled. So what do we want to do? First we want to basically set the animation for the flight actually. So because this is not an animation blueprint and it's an animation asset, we are gonna set the animation mode to this animation single node, because this is just one animation that is going to be played on loop. Then what are we going to do? We are going to set the animation asset. So we say set animation to flight animation. Then we are gonna order to play that animation. We say play animation. We can give it the flight animation, and we want this to be looping, so we say true. Then we have the owner movement. We want to set its movement mode. There are some default movement modes in the engine. We are going to use the flying one because we actually want to fly. But what if we want to disable the flight movement? We basically revert things back to their original. What we are going to do is we set the animation mode to animation blueprint. We set the anim class to the default animation class, and then the owner movement, we set its movement mode to walking, because we are reverting things back to their normal state. Okay, I just noticed that I set the name of this function to enable flight by mistake. I actually wanted to set it to elevate player, so we're gonna change its name over here too. Okay, that's it for it. Okay, so now toggling between flights, both the movement and the animation is basically done. What we will get to now is the elevation of player, so basically just moving the player up and down as the player commands to do so. Okay, so for elevation of player, the function called elevate player is called on the local machine of the player, and we want to request the server to do the elevation from this local function. So what we are gonna do is we call server elevate player, and it should receive the elevation value, and we receive the input value right over here. We are gonna say value.get, and we know that this is a float. It could be quite a few things. It could be vector or something, but we know that this is a float because that's how we want it to be. And then we get to the implementation of this server elevate player, and what we are going to do in this is that we don't actually take care of the elevation itself, but instead we set the vertical movement value to elevation value. So again, this vertical movement value is replicated, so we want it to be set by the server, not by the clients. So we set it right over here. But where are we going to use that value? We are going to use it in the event tick. Why do we want to do that? Because in this actually flying movement that I want to implement, I don't want the player to be able to slow down or anything. I want the player to go at a specific speed, not over or not below that speed, and that speed is basically what we populated this value with. As you can see, we set the max fly speed to that, but this is the maximum flying speed. It means that the player can go below that speed. So On event tick, if the speed of the player is below the speed we want the player to have, we are gonna manually set the speed of the player to what we want. So what we are gonna do is, at first we want some safety measure for when the basically owner actor is not initialized, or character movement is not flying, because we want this effect to only be applied if the player is flying. If they are walking, we want them to have control over their speed. And then if the velocity of the actor is below, it's actually below the speed that we want. So because this is gonna return from the function, we say that the velocity of the actor is equal or above flying speed. We are gonna return. So basically, if the owner actor is not valid, or the owner actor is not flying, or the speed of the owner actor is what we want it to be, we basically just return from the tick component. Then what we are gonna do is we wanna design a actually direction for the speed of the player. So we get the player's forward vector. This is the arrow that goes forward from the player, and then we want to add some z-axis to it. So we say direction.z is equal to vertical movement. So if the server says that the vertical movement should be 0, it means that the player has not requested the vertical movement to be applied, and they want to go ahead, basically, not up and down. There is no z, so this is set to 0. But if they say that they want to go down, the z is set to -1. If they say that they want to go up, this is set to 1. And then we want to normalize it, so the size of it is actually 0. So we say get safe normal. And then what we are gonna do is we manually set the velocity of the actor to direction multiplied by flying the speed. Basically, this direction is a vector, 3-dimensional vector that has a value of 1 because we have normalized it. Then this is going to be applied by the flying speed that we provide to it. So the value of the velocity would be equal to flying speed. Actually, the size of the velocity would be equal to flying speed in the direction of the direction that we want. And then in the end, we are going to set vertical movement to 0. Why do we want to set vertical movement to 0? Because basically this is a continuous action, and we want the vertical movement to stop as soon as the player lets go of this. So we basically set this to 0. One other thing we can do is that we can basically have a duplicate of this, and then we do completed, we do started for this, and we set the, just like we set the vertical movement to either 1 or -1 on the server. When this is completed, we call another function. I don't have a function here. We could say, name it like elevation cancel. We can have a function like that, and inside that we take the same process to basically set the vertical movement to 0. But this works too, and it's fine. So yeah, that's about it. There's just one thing remaining. This is an override function that you have to override if you have replicated variables inside your class. You have to basically explicitly tell the replication system that these variables should be replicated. So we say do rep lifetime, we provide the class name flying superpower component, and then one by one we have to provide the replicated variables we have. So let's see how many replicated variables we have. This is 1, this is 2, and that's it. So we do the same for this vertical movement, and we should be good to go right now. So I'm just gonna go ahead and build the project and then come back. Okay, so building that code was successful, and I've already gone ahead and attached that component to my character. I've assigned the mapping context, I've assigned the flight action and the elevation action, I've assigned the flight animation, default animation blueprint, and I've left the flying speed as its default from the C++ code. I'm just gonna show you how these actions look like. So for the toggle flight, we only need pressed. I'm basically reusing the one I used for super speed. That's why it also has released, but for this one we only want to use the pressed one. And then we have flight control. This time, as you can see here, this one is a boolean basically. This one is a float. That's why in the code, when we wanted to get the value of the input action, let me show you. Okay, right here we said it's a float because right over here we are setting this to a float. It could be a vector 2D or a vector 3D too, but it's float for our use case. And yeah, that's it. And then inside our superpowers mapping context, let's take a look at the flight control. We have assigned M without any modifiers. We have assigned N with the negate modifier because when N is pressed, we want the player to go down instead of up. So basically we want that float to be -1. So yeah, that's it. Let's go ahead and test it out. Okay, this is how it normally looks when I start playing, and when I press 0 it starts flying at full speed, and I can't basically just change the speed of it. I can only change the direction it flies to, and if I hold M it would elevate, if I hold N it would lower, and then if I press 0 again, it would basically just go back to normal with the normal speed. So yeah, that's it for the flying super speed. If you have any questions or confusions about this code, feel free to ask us, and have fun coding.